All right. Well, welcome to this exercise, etc. webinar, Rebuilding the Base, Overcoming Movement Compensation. Uh, I am really excited to get through this topic. This is one I hold dear to my heart, and it's made a lot of difference in my own personal training, but then obviously with my clients as well. All right, before we get too far, I just want you to know who you will be listening to over the next few hours. My name is Mike Fiebler. I am the Director of Education with Exercise, Etc. I'll just go a little bit about my background so you kind of know where I'm coming from. I was a former All-American track and field athlete at the University of Connecticut. I was a high jumper, and kind of that's where I think I really got started getting interest in movement and performance and things like that. From there, I got my master's degree at the University of Florida in exercise and sports science. And once I finished my schooling, or I guess traditional schooling, that's when the more life schooling came in, and I got through a few different certifications like the CSCS through the NSCA and a number of other certifications. I currently own a personal training studio in San Diego, California. And on top of that, I also, as well as teaching with Exercise, etc., I also teach at a community college out here, things like exercise science. So I love the teaching. I love the education side of this. I love the hands-on. I still train clients. So as we go through, these are things that I am personally doing in my own training with my clients. So we're not going to be just talking theory. We're going to be talking hands-on, the stuff that really will make a difference so you get better, faster results with your training program. So my goal is always for you to leave these workshops with tangible results, something that you can walk away with and apply right away, or at least have a good idea of how you can apply these different concepts that we are going to be talking about. So before we get into the topic, I just want to make sure you understand how this is going to work in case you haven't done a webinar with us before. Number one, you are going to complete the webinar. So it will track your hours spent on here, so you have to stick around and watch the whole thing, but you can pause and come back, and you don't have to do it in one setting, but just make sure you watch it in the entirety. You will pick up some great things, so take notes as we go. Once you do finish, you're going to go to our website at exerciseetc. On the top, you're going to click on the administration tab and click on webinars on demand certificates. Then you're going to choose the exact title of the webinar you viewed. Now, just be careful. Sometimes webinars have similar titles. You need to make sure you're choosing the exact one so you get the credits for the course that you actually took. If you're not sure, it will be in this webinar, but you can check your receipt and make sure you are using the correct title. From there, you are going to complete a short 20-question quiz that will be required based off of the presentation that we will be going through together. There will be a brief evaluation, so you can let us know what you thought of the course. And then finally, you'll be able to get your certificate, and you can download it or be emailed instantly to you. So just double check that you are using the correct and your best email so there's no delay in getting your certificate. Now, another important thing to remember, you must complete this webinar and print the certificate by December 31st in the same year in which you ordered it. If you wait too long, the company, the accrediting organization may not accept those CECs anymore. So you still get the great information, but we know those CECs are important, so you want to get credit for the education that you are going through. So just make sure that you don't wait too long. You watch this, take the quiz, and get your CECs in the same year that you ordered it. Okay, so let's get into this topic. Really, we're going to be talking a lot about function and movement and exercise and performance and all of these different things, because there is a trend in the fitness industry, and it's been focusing a lot on intensity. So different programs have been coming out and kind of going back to that whole no pain, no gain mentality of if you're not working hard, you're not getting results. And I think we've seen what that type of training does to pretty much everybody at some point. At some point, your body is going to give out. You're going to compensate. You're going to do things that really aren't natural, but we're going to keep pushing. And our joints are going to pay for this. Our muscles will pay for this. And really, our whole body is going to pay for just damaging it too much and not focusing on good quality movement. So now what's separating kind of the traditional trainer to the advanced coach is really showing this care in quality of movement and really paying attention to understanding what good movement is and how we can teach it to our clients. I mentioned that I was an athlete in college, and I picked up a lot of bad habits. Now, it was a Division I strength and conditioning program. I picked up some great things and learned a lot of great things. But when I look back at a lot of the training things we were doing, it was a very unbalanced program. Lots of pressing, not very much pulling. The same movements over and over and over again. And not that the movements themselves were bad, but I probably had no business doing a lot of them. Now, you know, in their defense, the coaches are working with teams and hundreds of athletes and trying to get through and kind of get everybody performing the best they can. But some people are going to actually probably do worse on this because they're going to develop complications, they're going to develop injuries and potential problems that will cause issues down the road. Now, I was able to make it through my 4 years of training, but I always question, did I really hit my peak potential? And what consequences came from that style of training where we were just pushing as hard as we can, and even if I didn't quite have the movement down properly, I would still do it. And you know, one thing I've always struggled with is something like just not being able to get my shoulder joint in a good position, yet we did tons of overhead exercises. Now, I was a high jumper, and I had my fair share of lower body injuries that I dealt with, but I had a numerous amount of upper body injuries. And this was because it was from my training. And I think this is an important concept that we have to look at. When you really question how many people out there are actually hurt as a direct cause of their training program, that number is going to be really high, right? Most of us are going to be guilty of doing something that directly related to an injury. Now, I'm not going to say you can prevent every single injury out there, but we definitely can manage our risk. And I think a lot of people are putting themselves at a high risk because they don't pay attention to movement, and they keep trying to, you know, shove that round peg into a square hole and just force it to work, when really we need to take a step back and see, well, what's our limiting factor here? What is preventing us from moving properly? And can we address that before we try and load somebody up with squats and pushes and pulls and those types of things? So what I really want you to get out of this webinar is really thinking about some of these things and really looking at your program that you're writing for a client and seeing, are we putting our clients at an unnecessary risk? And are we addressing the things that really need to be addressed? And sometimes, and I've been guilty of this as well, where we kind of let the client sometimes dictate the program because they like doing a certain thing or they always want to do something. And I'm not saying you can never do something a client likes, but we just have to keep their best interest in mind and understand, well, is this actually contributing to some of the pain that they've been dealing with, or is it contributing to some type of movement dysfunction? So our first step is really just understanding, well, what is preventing them from moving in the first place? And I wish there was an easy answer. This is something that you have to explore a little bit more. But we can look at something, well, can their joints even access adequate range of motion? If your shoulder, when you raise it over your head, only goes so far, and you can't get that arm all the way up overhead because of limited range of motion, well, what good is an overhead press going to do you? It's only going to make you compensate, and you're always going to find a way to do it, right? But you're going to find the wrong way to do it, and that's going to become the new norm, and that's going to be comfortable to you, even though you might be damaging your back or your shoulder or whatever in the process. So we need to understand, well, okay, can your joint even get into this position? We've all been in the situation where we try and cue a client and we tell them to get into a certain position and we show them and we do all these cool things, and they can't do it. And we get frustrated, they get frustrated, right? This trainer that we see in this picture, is he just gonna let this happen right here and have that person, you know, they're wearing their back brace, so they should be all good to go. But we know that's probably not the best position that they can get in. So maybe they're sitting there and trying to cue them to get a better hip hinge and to get into a better neutral spine. What if their hips just don't get there because they don't have a good enough range of motion in the posterior chain? So they can be screaming at them to get in the right position, and it doesn't matter how hard they try, that client just can't get there. So this exercise is actually going to be contributing to some of the problems that they're having. So we might say, hey, you know what, we can't do this type of deadlifting. Maybe deadlifting at all is going to be eliminated until we've cleared some range of motion there. All right, some people, they have range of motion, right? And now this is the person that sometimes the cueing actually gets them into a better position, but they just don't feel comfortable there. They don't understand how to stabilize a joint and control it. Even though their joints aren't limited with range of motion, they still sometimes look like it is, or they just aren't coordinated enough to really control all these different joints, all these different muscles moving at the same time. So this is where different screens and assessments come in handy, where you can really determine what's the limiting factor, right? Have we checked their mobility? If it's cleared and they're just not getting in a good position, I know maybe it's more of a stability issue that that person's having. Or we looked at their range of motion and they are just tight. And I know, okay, if we don't address this mobility, it won't just naturally get better. Okay, so first step, I want to make sure that we are determining why proper movement was reduced or lost. So this is kind of what we just touched on. Is it impaired mobility? Or is there some type of stability issue and they just can't control? Is there muscular weakness? They're just not strong enough to hold that position for very long. Is it something in their lifestyle, something that is just constant movements that they're doing, or stress, or nutrition, or lack of sleep? All of these things we just kind of forget about, but they're all absolutely going to affect movement and movement quality. Is there some kind of chronic disease or disability? All of these different things are going to influence movement. Now, it could be one of these, it could be all of these, or any combination. So it's really important that we understand what our client's going through. And one important thing that I want to make sure I touched on this at some point, when we look at these different things, you are not going to sell them in 2 hours a week with a client, or however many hours or sessions you work with somebody. And that's critical that we understand that. We might prevent it from getting worse, but if all they're doing is some stretches or some exercises when they see you, that's only going to get them so far. Because if it is a lifestyle issue, if this is something they sit for 8 hours every single day, and then they come see you twice a week, and you stretch their shoulders, you stretch their hips, and do some of that, it's only, you know, you're fighting a losing battle here the whole time. The odds are absolutely against you. So we need to give them homework. And with the drills that we go through in this webinar, a lot of these are great examples of homework that you can give somebody. Now, don't overwhelm somebody and give them like 8 different exercises to do. It's pick the 1 or 2 that will benefit them the most. If it's mobility restricting them, give them 1 or 2 mobility exercises to do. Maybe it's a couple foam rolling exercises, or maybe a few stretches they can do at home with minimal equipment while they watch TV. But we need to make sure we're picking on that weakest link, where we know what's the biggest reason they've lost this movement, and now let me do everything I can to attack that as often as I can. So I want you to do this 1 to 2 stretches, 1 to 2 times a day, every single day. All right, and then we're going to see how you can manage that and progress along. Then we're going to go through some remedial progressions, right? So once we understand what the issue is, we need to start attacking it. So we're going to go through some mobility training. We're going to go through some stability training. We're going to go through our performance training, our resistance training. So you may spend more or less time in certain areas, but that's kind of the simplified version of the process that we are going to take each client through. Okay, so let's assume that mobility is restricted. So if mobility is restricted, this has to be where we start, because if the joint just can't move, all of the other stuff like stability or strength training that we throw on top of it won't be as effective, because hey, that joint just can't get into the position that you want it to. So now if you start loading that joint up, it's going to compensate, and it's going to wear and tear on some of the connective tissue, and now your shoulder's bugging you, or your knee, or your back, or whatever it might be. So we need to make sure that we are working on mobility. There are clearly hundreds and thousands of ways that you can work on mobility. We're just going to touch on a couple, but the idea is that you are doing something. Now, I want to at least give you some guidelines to follow, and this is an important part, that we are involving the neuromuscular system, not just the muscular system. So if we're just holding a joint position, so you do kind of that hamstring stretch that everybody knows, where they kind of put their foot on something and they lean forward and try and touch their toes, right? If you do that for a minute or two, for sure you're going to get the muscles to relax, and you're probably going to get a little bit more mobility there. But we all know what happens after that. What happens the next day? Did that stick? Right? So it's important to understand that we not only have to improve mobility through some type of stretching or flexibility exercise, but we have to use the nervous system and the muscular system to work together to relearn how to use this new mobility, right? So just because I gave you a few degrees range of motion in your hips or your shoulders, you haven't used that in forever, right? So probably years for many people. They won't all of a sudden, just because you gave them more range of motion, say, oh, I can squat deeper, I can do these different movements a little bit better, because they've already created a bad program or motor program or habit or behavior, whatever you want to call it. But that program has been written with limited range of motion, and that is their new normal. So now you have to actually reteach them how to do the movement properly, right? So we can use the example that we often give, like if you sprained your ankle and you know, you're limping around because it hurts, because the body wants to avoid pain, so it's going to try and shift your weight to the other side, and you're going to get around however you can until that pain goes away. And for some people, that pain goes away, but now they notice they're putting more weight on the other side, they limp a little bit more, and one side is kind of dominating all movements that they do. That's an example of what we're talking about here. So they've created a new habit, and you have to restore that. It won't naturally get better unless you specifically challenge what has been lost there. So making them stand on one leg and putting more weight on that one leg, for example. And because the whole goal is we're going to work on this mobility so we get better at fundamental movements, things like deadlifting or hip hinging, squatting and lunging and being on one leg and pushing and pulling and rotating. So these are all the different movements that we're going to go through. Once we've cleared some better mobility and improved some joint stability, then we want to put it all together and work on these fundamental movements, because this is what we do in real life for the most part. The drills leading up to this, they're temporary drills just to get us a little bit better, better capable of doing some of these big movement patterns. So when we look, obviously every joint potentially could be limited and needs more range of motion. So even the ones that are not listed here, and we'll have a slide coming up that'll go through other joints as well. But when we look big picture and how functional movement occurs, you may have heard of the joint-by-joint approach to mobility and stability that Mike Boyle and Gray Cook have made popular in the fitness industry. But this idea of joints alternating roles between mobility and stability. And now all joints require some mobility, all joints require some stability. But when we look how they were naturally designed, we see that there is a higher demand for one or the other. So we'll talk about stability later, but the joints you see here are kind of the big mobility specific joints. So the ankles, the hips, the thoracic spine or thorax, the glenohumeral joint. And sure, there are more, but we know we probably have limited time with clients, and most likely we can't work on every single joint. So we're going to just focus on where we're going to get the most bang for our buck. And these 4 specific joints, if they move well, there's a good chance that they can at least have enough to get by and do some of these big functional movements. So that's where a lot of our effort is going to focus. Okay, so what is normal range of motion? Sometimes this is hard to define, but what you see here is from the Merck Physical Therapy Manual, 2019. And it's looking at kind of that anatomical position, how joints go through different range of motion. And obviously this isn't everything, but here we have some of the big ranges of motion. Now, how you use this information, it's kind of up to you. Now, this will depend on your background. Can you measure some of these things? So you can take each joint through its active range of motion and see what that person can do. And you might use a goniometer to do this, and there are apps now that you can download on your phone that will help in this process and just make it really easy to now, depending on who you talk to, you're going to have variations with some of these, and it'll also depend, are we talking on like active range of motion or passive range of motion? So like active range of motion would be like how far you can take a joint through, and then passive range of motion would be like somebody else taking you through that range of motion. So, for example, if you were looking at like a leg raise, like to look at the posterior chain and to see how much hip flexion you could go through, you laying on your back, raising one leg as high as you can, that would be active, and we'd see how far you get. Passive would be if somebody took your leg and you relaxed and they took you through range of motion. So it might sound, well, why would you look at each one? There are often times when they are not the same, where passively you have great range of motion, but actively you don't. And what this is telling you is actually that your mobility isn't the restriction, it's actually more of that control, that stability. You don't understand how to go through that range of motion. So it helps determine what's the best course of action. So you can throw them on a foam roller and do lots of stretching, but you'll see that that's probably not helping too much because they already have the range of motion. What instead will help is actually taking them through the range of motion actively so they understand how to use this range of motion, kind of what we were talking about before. So as we go through our mobility drills, what the key is, we're going to try and do a little bit of both. So just in case you're not sure, you're not able to test every single joint, you know, you're not a therapist and you're not getting hands-on, you can still take people through different mobility drills and add some stability work so we kind of get a little bit of each and cover some of these areas there. So I do think it's good to go through some screening and assessing with your client. You know, depending on your background, you might go through more specific ones, but I at least wanted to cover a couple of these that are really simple that you can go through and just really watch. You don't need to measure anything. The numbers are pretty clear on what you should be able to do. So something like cervical rotation. Now, active range of motion, we'll probably see like 80 degrees on each side. So if you were just standing up nice and tall, turn your head to one side, you would almost be able to get to 90 degrees. Turn your head the other side, you would almost be able to get to 90 degrees with no compensations there. So we've kind of just checked that you have that range of motion there. Because one thing we know is if there's neck issues, it's probably going to relate right to the shoulder as well, which is a big one for a lot of people. And if we totally ignore the cervical spine, we aren't going to see the same kind of results because that might be the underlying issue versus the shoulder. So it's good to look at both things there. Moving down, we can look at thoracic rotation. So a really easy drill you can do, and if you're probably sitting down as you are listening to this, and if you are, I want you to sit up nice and tall. It's nice if you have something to squeeze between your feet, or I'm sorry, between your knees, like a yoga block or something like that. And all you're going to do is sit up nice and tall. You're going to cross your arms so you're grabbing the opposite shoulders, pointing your elbows straight out, and then without moving your legs, squeezing that yoga block, you're going to turn as far as you can to one side. You're going to rotate from the thoracic spine, and then we're going to turn as far as we can the other way. So we're looking for about 45 degrees. So again, that's halfway between 90 degrees. So if 90 degrees is straight out to the side, are they getting about halfway across? So sometimes using a dowel rod actually is easy because the dowel will point to how far they get. We should see it pointing to at least 45 degrees on each side. So I'm not going to go through each of these because things like lumbar rotation, flexion, extension, well, yes, these should be moving. These might be higher risk things, and we're not going to actually look at specific movement there unless you need to for any reason. So I just want to cover some of the big ones. Shoulder flexion is another really easy one. You can have somebody lay on their back on the floor, knees bent, trying to keep the pelvis in good alignment so they're not sinking into an anterior pelvic tilt. And then what you're going to do is one arm at a time, without bending the elbow, you're just going to reach up into flexion. I usually have them point their thumb up. So when they reach, I want to see, can you touch your thumb to the floor without compensating? And the big compensations are they bend the elbow, right? They're trying to use elbow flexion to get there, or they extend and go into that anterior pelvic tilt. So they use their lumbar spine to create the shoulder movement. So the ribs should stay down as they go through that range of motion. So I test on one side, I'll look at the other side, and it's pass-fail. You can either touch the floor or you can't. Then looking at both arms at the same time. And often what you'll see is they can do it one arm at a time, but they can't do it with both. So now we know, again, just giving us information. So, hey, when you have both arms overhead, you have a harder time, and everybody does, because you're requiring both sides to move at the same time. So this might tell you, hey, you know what? You probably shouldn't be doing overhead pressing with both arms at the same time because you have limited range of motion there and you're probably going to compensate. But you seem to be okay with one arm, so we're going to stick to more single arm presses with something like that. Going through, and again, we don't have to cover all of these, hip flexion. So laying on your back, bringing your knee towards your chest, so being able to get to about 125 degrees. You'll see a lot of people struggle even to get to 90 degrees with something like that. And we can look at internal and external rotation. This isn't an assessment webinar, but I just at least want to cover a few. Ankle dorsiflexion is another big one. So 20 degrees would be kind of at a minimum there. Really, if we're looking at closed chain dorsiflexion, you should be able to get about 40 degrees range of motion there. So an easy test you can do, if you take a piece of tape and just put it about 5 inches away from a wall, have somebody line their toe up on that piece of tape, and then they're going to bend, so they'll have one foot on the toe, on the line, the other foot behind them, and they just bend their knee as far forward as they can. They should be able to touch their knee to the wall. That would be about 40 degrees of dorsiflexion to be able to do something like that. And they need to be able to do it without lifting their heel. They need to be able to do it without their knee driving in. So you have to watch out for both of those complications as they do that. So I know it might be hard to see all these. I at least wanted to give you an idea of some of the simple things you can do, to look at the shoulders, to look at the thoracic spine, to look at the hips, to look at the ankles, right? To just determine, do I even need to worry about this? If their range of motion is really good, then we don't spend a lot of time working on mobility. They've just shown that their mobility is great. These are probably the people that really enjoy things like yoga and stretching because they're already really good at it. Not that we have to remove it from their exercise, because if they like it, we probably want to keep it there so they keep enjoying it, but it shouldn't be the priority, and we probably shouldn't spend as much time on this. We can focus on other things and get more benefit from it. Okay, so like I said, what are we focusing on? So if you can, let's assess these to these. Are the ankles limited? Are the hips limited? Is the thoracic spine limited and the glenohumeral joint? Are any of these limited, or are all of them limited? If they are, we know we need to work on mobility. If they are not, you can still work on mobility as kind of a warm-up, but not as important for them. Maybe I don't need to give them homework to work on these things. But if they were restricted, this is a great opportunity to help them. Give them some homework assignments to help improve these different joints. Okay, so there are a million different drills we can do to work on mobility, and there's foam rolling and all the other self-myofascial release tools that you can be using. Those are all great options. So I'm obviously not going to be covering everything. I just wanted to focus on a few key concepts to consider. So when we are working on ankle mobility, this is a great option. So doing something like a closed chain dorsiflexion drill. So a couple things I want you to point out in this picture. So we're going into half kneeling. You can do this standing as well, up on a step if they can't go to one knee, but this is a great option here. It's hard to see in the picture, but she's actually got her front foot on a wedge, so it's naturally putting her in dorsiflexion. So we're just kind of exaggerating that stretch. Now the stick there is doing a couple things. It's helping with balance, right? So she doesn't worry about falling over. I really just want her to work on moving that joint and not really worrying about staying upright. But when you push that stick into the floor, it's going to engage some of those deep core stabilizers, which is always a good thing. So sometimes when we're working on mobility, we kind of sacrifice our stability somewhere else in order to get range of motion. This just helps prevent that. So all we're going to do is rock back and forth. So you can see the picture on the left, that knee is kind of right above the heel, and then we're going to drive forward and push that knee as far past the toe as they can. Now, we want to make sure, just like I mentioned earlier, that that knee is not caving in. So when you look down, you should be able to see where your big toe is. If you can't see your big toe because your knee is blocking it, it means that knee is actually dropping into that valgus position, which is not a good pattern that we want to teach that person. We want to let them know that, hey, when you dorsiflex, the knee needs to stay out. Right? That's exactly like it would look like during a squat, or in this case, like a single leg squat. But this is an important thing. Ankle mobility is linked to a lot of different issues. Gait dysfunction is a big one, but increased forces going through the knee, the low back, and other impairments are most likely shortly to follow. So if you're not looking at the ankle, this is one that not everybody needs it, but a lot of people out there do, especially if they've had a history of sprained ankles and not really gone through therapy and just don't stretch in general. They're going to need a lot of different work to improve that mobility there. Okay, then just kind of moving up the chain, going to the hips. So the hips are the gateway to the core. So when we see a joint that lacks mobility, the joints surrounding it, which are typically stability joints, are going to pay for it, and they're going to do too much. So when the hips lack range of motion, the knees are probably going to do a little bit more movement than they should do, and the lower back or the lumbar spine is going to be doing some movement that it shouldn't be doing. So we need to make sure those hips are staying healthy so we're not sacrificing that stability anywhere else. Now, obviously, the hips are very mobile, or at least they're supposed to be very mobile. So when we're working on mobility, we have to focus on different areas of the hip and different patterns that it goes through. So we need to look at anterior hip mobility. We need to look at posterior hip mobility. We need to look at some type of rotation and adduction, even abduction, right? So we need to concentrate. And now, depending on the exercises you do, you can get a lot of these things in one exercise or two or whatever. So if you don't have, I don't have that much time to go through every single one of these, then you start to pick and choose the most appropriate ones that'll give them the best opportunity to get better. And you're going to make sure that, or try and find some that maybe you can combine and get a little bit of hip, a little bit of shoulder, whatever it might be, all in one stretch. Okay, so with our anterior hip, so now we have the quads and our hip flexors are going to be typically our limiting factor here. So we need to make sure we are doing some type of hip opening. So if they are stuck in that anterior pelvic tilt, it is telling us right off the bat that they need some work to help them get into a neutral spine. So both of these are great options right here. I want to start with the ones on the left. It looks very similar to the ankle one that we were just doing. Now, there is a little bit of ankle work here, but really we're trying to focus on the hips. Now, here's the hard part. When most people work on hip flex or stretching their hip flexors, they get in this half kneeling position and they drive their hips forward. And often what happens is they feel a little stretch in the quad and the hip flexor because it is being stretched, but really where they're driving that movement from, it's all from their lumbar spine. So what we need to make sure is they understand what a level pelvis is. We need to make sure we have good pelvic alignment before we do the stretch. So how we start, I'll see if I can draw some pictures here to help too. We need to make sure, oh, that was a little too big. We have a nice tall alignment here. So the knee, the hip, the shoulder are all in a straight line. What we're going to have to cue them to do is make sure, hang on, I want to see if I can find a smaller. Okay. What we need to make sure they do is they maintain this alignment as they go through. What most people, when they drive into this hip stretch, there we go, they're going to go all from the lumbar spine and really push all from their lower back versus the hip. So what we need to make sure they do is level the pelvis first. Now, there's a couple ways you can do it. I usually use the cueing. You are going to imagine you had a big belt buckle, and I want you to grab that belt buckle and pull it up to your belly button. So all we're doing here is teaching them a posterior pelvic tilt. So we get rid of this big curve in their back. Just doing that alone usually puts people in a stretched position. So they haven't leaned forward at all, but they feel those hip flexors stretching. Now, the stick is there for the same reason I mentioned before. If you hold that stick with your arm straight and push it into the floor like you're trying to squish a bug, your core stabilizes, and now your pelvis are more likely to stay in the same position. Now, for some people, we just stay here and we breathe. We focus on good quality breath. Other people, they might go to the second posture and they actually start to rock forward. But what we really need to keep our eye on is right here. You can see my arrow. That lumbar spine, are they sacrificing stability by increasing that curve there? Now, there might be a natural curve, which is fine. I'm exaggerating it a little bit with this drawing, but the picture won't change from the left or from the starting position to the stretch when they lean forward. As long as they maintain the same position, we're probably in good shape, unless they're already in an exaggerated curve right from the start. I think for most people, that's a perfect anterior hip mobility drill. You can add a little bit to it. In the second picture, reaching that arm overhead is going to get a little bit deeper. You're going to get the abs working, a little bit of stretch there, as well as the psoas, a little bit deeper hip flexor there. You can even add a rotation if we want to get more into the thoracic spine and glenohumeral joint as well, all we would do here is, if we use this picture as an example, with the left knee down and right leg up, you're actually going to take that left arm, put it on the outside of this knee, so it's kind of pushing up against it, and then you're going to take your right hand, the right arm, and reach behind you as far as you can. So now you're getting your hip flexor on this side and the shoulder on this side across the body. So we have a nice kind of twofer there if you're just trying to consolidate so you don't have to do quite as many stretches there. But we'll get into other shoulder stretches as well. Okay, posterior. So now we're talking the calves are going to play a role here, the glutes, the hamstrings, that whole backside. So here's super simple drill. And the reason I know this doesn't probably look like anything too shocking, but I want these to be so simple a client will do them. And that's really what the emphasis is here. So something like this, it's a leg extension, essentially. So you're going to lay on your back. Now, if they're a little bit tighter in that anterior hip, you may have to bend the down leg, so the left leg here, just to give them, to help keep that neutral spine or that neutral pelvis. We want to make sure they're not just going right into an anterior or a posterior pelvic tilt. Everything's neutral. So they start with like a 90-degree bend in the knee, and then they just do a leg extension. They kick it all the way up. The reason I love this one so much is because we get a little bit of that strength at the same time. So I want you to squeeze your quad as tight as you can and try and touch your heel to the ceiling. This is going to be a great way to engage through that active range of motion. So now you're understanding, hey, I can do this. I can get through that full range. Now, if they can't get it all the way up, they're going to get it as high as they can, but they just go through repetitions where they squeeze, squeeze, and relax. All right, and then we have lots of hip rotator and adductor work that we can do, seated and supine, rotation stretches, so just propping that foot up on one knee, and then going, pushing the hip into external rotation for both of these. So on the floor, this requires a lot of mobility. You can see she's got that knee pretty much all the way to her chest. So if I saw somebody do that much range of motion, then I know that they really don't need this stretch. They're showing almost excessive range of motion. Now, they might like it and it might feel good, but it may not be helping them because they're hypermobile. So it just depends on the situation. The seated one, you can see using a little bit of manual resistance to kind of pushing that knee away might help. We don't need to be too aggressive, but just to kind of help get a little bit deeper into that stretch. And then anytime you can add some movement with it. So sometimes when we're seated in that stretch, you can do this again if you're sitting listening. If you take that knee and pull it up to your chest just by kind of using the internal rotator, so we're going to take the hip through internal rotation, kind of hold it there as you hold that stretch, and then we're going to go into external rotation and push that knee down to the floor. And we just go back and forth. So we are stretching, but we're trying to strengthen this range of motion so they learn how to control that whole movement there. And then adductors is going to be a big one. This is typically my go-to adductor stretch. So we start out on all fours. We kick one leg out to the side. Try and keep that foot pointing as forward as you can. So this should be pointing straight ahead. So it's turned out a little bit, so we want to keep it straight. And we also want to keep it nice and flat because you get a little bit of ankle work there too. And then all we do is rock back and forth in this position. Right, so you sit back, you get a nice adductor stretch, and then you pull back. And I like working a breath work in it. So you exhale as you push the hips back, you inhale as you come back up. And we're just keeping the quad tight as we go through so there's no bend in that knee. So a great adductor stretch that most people just love how that one feels. Okay, and then we have our 90-90 stretch. There are pretty much a million variations we can do off of this stretch, but I want to keep it just simple. So it's something, again, they can do it at home. It's they can do it while watching TV. They get into the 90-90 position. So we're essentially just making a box right here. Just have an imaginary line there. So that's the 90-90. So we have 90 degree at the knees, pretty much 90 degrees everywhere. Now, there's a ton we can do right from this position. Now, before you even start, if they're really uncomfortable here, you might have to take like a roller or block or something and put it underneath their hip, which will elevate them off the ground a little bit. And that might be more comfortable, because if they're so uncomfortable here, they're holding their breath and really struggling, they're less likely to do it, and they're probably not even getting what they want to get out of it, because we need to relax. We need to let go as we sink into these different stretches. So once we get in a good position, the first thing you do is we have to get tall. I want you to get as tall as you can, lift that chest up nice and high. Then you're going to start to lean forward. Now, the goal is not to touch your chest to your knee. If you're at that point, again, you probably don't need this stretch. You're mobile enough, and we really don't need to work on this. Or you're cheating and rounding your back to get there. So we need a nice straight spine, and we flex at the hip, and just like you're doing a deadlift, right? So you keep that chest up tall, and we push out. Now we can do some great things here to create some tension, so we get strong in this position as well. So the first one is, if you kind of have your hands spread out. So one hand is by your heel, the other hand is by the opposite, or the knee. And what I want you to do is, as you're leaning forward, you're going to push into the floor with those hands. And imagine you were trying to push the floor away. It's almost like you were going to do a split with your arms, but they won't actually move. You're just creating tension. This is going to help keep you in that nice tall posture as you lean forward, so you're not rounding your back, right? And then you're just going to hang out there and breathe in that position. We can add a little bit of really great things to this. So one, let's do a little bit of PNF stretching here. So what I want you to do is, as you're leaning forward, and again, do this with me, I'll kind of talk you through it. You're pushing your hands into the floor. You're going to take that right knee, or the front knee, and I want you to push it into the floor. So now we're actually engaging some of those hip rotators. I want you to stay leaning forward still. We're still in that stretch, but now you're going to push that knee into the floor, and then you're going to take your left glute and drive like you're squeezing. So you're trying to like push forward into hip extension. So now both hips are firing as we hold this stretch right here, and you're just going to hold that for like 10 to 20 seconds, breathing the whole time. Then you're going to relax, and then see if you can sink a little bit deeper into that stretch. And we can just do a couple cycles of that, contract and relax. And it's a great way to add a little PNF, great way to add the neuromuscular system working together. You can do the same exact thing, but the opposite. We'll use some of the internal rotators. So once you get into that stretch position, I want you to pull that knee off the ground. You might not be able to, that's fine, you just try to. You're going to feel kind of those muscles on the inside of the thigh engage. And now you're going to stay leaning forward, hold that for 10 to 20 seconds. And then you'll back off, and then go back into the stretch, see if you can get a little bit further, and you can repeat. You can even go into a nice little stretch if you're sitting in the same exact position here, and you take your left hand and put it behind you and lean back. Now, still staying tall, chest up, you just lean back. Now you're getting into that top hip a little bit more. And then we can do the same thing we just did in this position. So once you get there, pushing those hands into the ground, staying nice and tall, you can push your left knee into the floor. Hold that for 10 to 20 seconds. Then you can relax, see if you can get a little deeper into the stretch, do a couple cycles of that. Then you can try and lift that knee off the ground. So now we're trying to engage the external rotators. Hold that for 10 to 20 seconds. Then relax and repeat. So I know it's a lot of work. Hopefully it all makes sense. And some people are going to be definitely sweating after something like this. It is hard, especially if you're tight. But this is going to give us a better opportunity to not just gain mobility, but have some strength within that mobility. Okay, moving on. And again, I know I'm just showing a couple for each stretches. So if you have your favorite hip mobility drills, see if you can work on adding some of that kind of PNF, contract, relax, or just getting the hips in a better position as we go through each one. So shoulder mobility, so we're talking about the thoracic spine and the glenohumeral joint. So often inhibited when we are that desk jockey. So if you're sitting all day and you're not doing anything for those shoulders, if you're not doing anything for those hips, they tend to stay that way. All right, so like I mentioned, shoulder mobility is required for overhead pressing motion. So if you lack shoulder mobility, then we need to take some of those certain exercises out right now, because you're only going to be setting yourself up for issues down the road. Right, so once we work on some of that mobility, we're going to retrain the movements. We can add in the shoulder pressing and other overhead movements when it's appropriate. Right, but we have to address those tight areas. We have to strengthen those weak areas. Right, what you see here is the athlete scratch test. It's a nice little test to see what kind of shoulder range of motion somebody has. So you take one hand, so the picture on the left, we reach up over the head and down your back. And we're looking at shoulder flexion, external rotation, and scapular abduction, right? And you should be able to touch your opposite shoulder blade when you do that. You should be able to do that on both sides, both arms. Then we look at the other side. We look at shoulder extension, internal rotation, and scapular adduction, and reach behind the back and up. And you should be able to touch the opposite shoulder blade again. Now, it's important to remember, if you're going to do something like this, most people are going to cheat. They're going to do some like creeping, crawling type stuff. They're going to grab their shirt and like pull. You should be able to do this in one smooth movement with no creeping, crawling. You just smoothly reach behind your back, touch your shoulder blade. You reach up over your head and down, touch your shoulder blade. If it's anything but smooth and easy, I would just say you can't do this, and this is something we need to work on. Okay, so now we have some great drills here. So this is a T-spine extension and extension rotation as well. Now, one thing you should be able to do is separate the T-spine and the lumbar spine. Not always. Sometimes it's okay to get a little bit of both going in there, but sometimes we do want to separate it. So you need to understand how can I do that and when you should be able to do that. So for example, if we look at the first stretch, so here we're primarily looking at T-spine extension, although with that dowel behind your head, you're getting a little bit of external rotation of the shoulder as well. So what you do in this one, this is actually the finished position. It's almost like a cat-cow. So this is one that you are getting a little bit of lumbar flexion and extension, but we're just trying to emphasize the thoracic spine extension and flexion. So how you'll start is you'll kind of be on all fours, so your knees on the ground, your elbows on the bench, holding a stick out in front of you. So the stick will actually start kind of over here. You are going to push your back into kind of that cat position. So we're actually looking for flexion. Then what you're going to do is sit back into this position. You are going to bring that stick behind your head, almost like you're doing a bicep curl, and you're going to sit back. Now we're trying to get into full spine extension. And then we're just going to cycle back and forth through this. So it almost looks like you're doing a bicep curl with that stick where you kind of reach it out and then bring it behind your head. But what we really want to focus on, once you sit back into this position, we want to think about right here, that upper back, that T-spine really extending. So it's like they're trying to reach their chest to the floor here, right? We just cycle back and through. So we have a nice active stretch, and we're trying to use gravity in the bench and the stick to help them get through the stretch, but they're using their own strength to explore what their active range of motion is. In our second stretch, we're going to go into, this is called a lumbar lock position, and we're going to go through an extension and rotation stretch. So lumbar lock is just getting down so we have greater than 90 degrees of hip flexion. So you'll start with both elbows on the floor, and then you're sitting back almost like a child pose. Then you'll take one hand, put it behind your head is one option. You could put it behind your back is another option, or you can just reach across and grab the opposite rib if you have a hard time getting your hand behind your back. So there's lots of ways we can modify this. And then all you're going to do is rotate. Now this is one that I mean, really all these stretches you should be incorporating breathing, but this one, most people really are tight here and they struggle, so they naturally just hold their breath, which isn't going to help us. Anytime you hold your breath, it's telling your brain that this is a bad position and you shouldn't go back here. So even if we get a little bit of range of motion, we're most likely not going to keep it because our nervous system just doesn't want to go back there. It kind of associates it with pain. So what you're going to do is starting, let's say you're doing your hand behind your head, your elbow's at the floor, and you're going to take a deep breath in, and then you're going to exhale and reach your elbow up to the ceiling. And notice her eyes are looking at her elbow. The movement starts with the eyes, and then the head turns, and then the shoulder turns. Right? So we're getting everything pointing in the same direction. Now you get a lot out of this, especially if you think about this arm. If you push that forearm into the floor, it's going to help engage that core, engage the shoulder, and help you get more range of motion. And again, I know I'm repeating myself, but we get some like active range of motion, and they're learning how to use this rotation, not just statically kind of going through it. Okay, Another group, now we're focusing a little bit more on the glenohumeral joint. This is the three-way stretch. So the shoulder joint is obviously very mobile, or it should be. So kind of like the hip, you need to work it in different ranges of motion. So this is a nice one just because we have an easy setup here, and you just really turn your body and hold on to the band the whole time. So we start, the picture on the left, you just kind of loop your hand through that band. You're going to have the same foot forward as the arm that we're stretching. And we're just going to kind of step into it until we get a nice neck shoulder stretch right here. Now pay attention, we don't sacrifice anything else. Their neck is staying relaxed. They're keeping their pelvis neutral here. And we just hold that stretch and breathe. So this could be just a nice static stretch. I don't want to make it sound like static stretching is bad. It still can be very helpful. But if you're only doing static stretching, then you want to make sure you're following up with some stability exercises afterwards. Okay, so after we hold this for 30 seconds, 45 seconds, maybe even up to a minute, we're going to turn. So now you're going to face where the bar or where the band is attached to. So here it's just tied to a pull-up bar. And now you're just going to lean forward, and we're going to go into a nice lat stretch here as you reach up. So they're just looking down, they're leaning forward and breathing. A nice little addition, if you want to get a little bit more of a stretch here, you can take this right leg and extend it straight back. That's going to kind of stretch from the foot to the hand all the way across that side body. I can even add, if I step across this way, now we're getting even more of a stretch there. So we're really lengthening that whole chain to get some good stretching there. Okay, and then finally, we're going to stretch out the posterior shoulder by turning all the way and letting the band pull your arm across your body. As you do this, just make sure you're retracting the shoulders, you're keeping the neck relaxed, and just relaxing as you pull across to get a nice posterior stretch there. So it's a super simple way to get some great stretches in that shoulder, easy setup, and again, they can do it at home. All you need is a band. Okay, like I've been talking about, just make sure we are strengthening mobility. So we've already been doing that. I'm just going to show a few more just in case you did more of a static stretch and you need to still get some strength work in there as well. So this is a key though. You need to do it in some form because this is how we get that mobility to stick, right? Where we really learn how to use it. So not just increasing flexibility, but we're using the neuromuscular system to relearn how to use that restored mobility. Okay, so let's say, for example, we did something to get more posterior chain flexibility. So the glute, the hamstring, something along those lines. So this one in particular would be the glutes, that maybe we had some tightness, maybe when I mentioned that hip flexor test. So this is it right here. So if you just look at the picture on the right, you start laying down on your back and you bring your knee as close to your chest as you can go without using your hands. And you should be able to get about 125 degrees there. Okay, so we can see we're actually pretty good right here. If they're short, maybe they only get to 90 degrees. Right, so the leg is straight up here. Then I know, all right, something's limiting them. We need to work on this. So maybe we do some glute stretching, right? So the picture on the left, maybe we're doing something like that, like knee to chest, and we're just getting a good stretch there. Now, if I want to add a little bit more to it to get some strength with it, now what you do is, so we do our stretch here. You're going to hold that knee to your chest. Now what we're going to do is, when I say go, I want you to let go of your knee, and I don't want it to drop at all. And then you're going to hold this position on the right for at least 10 seconds, keeping your knee as high as you can. So they start with that nice stretch. We're getting some good range of motion. Then they're going to engage their hip flexor. But sometimes the hip flexor gets a bad rap. You know, we sit a lot, we have issues with it, it's tight, but it's weak, and we have to strengthen it. And most people kind of ignore the hip flexor altogether, or they only stretch it. You need to engage it as well. So that's what we're doing here. We get some good core activation, we get good hip flexor activation, which is teaching us how to use this new range of motion that we just got, right? So you just hold it, 10 seconds, breathe, then you relax. And then you can alternate sides, and you do a couple reps on each side. So it's a great way we combine a stretch with an activation drill to kind of lock in that new range of motion that we're trying to teach. Okay, this is a really tough one, but one of my favorites. This is Kevin Carr. He is with the Certified Functional Strength Coach program. They have some great exercises and do a lot of kind of this strengthening, stretching type movement. So we already showed the 90-90 position. That's kind of where this is starting. So you start in that 90-90 position, and we go through the same stretches that we talked about. So I would start with some of the ones we've already talked about, just pushing your knee into the ground and lifting your knee off the ground and just doing kind of those isometric holds. If you're ready to try and take it through more range of motion, we can do something like this. So what you're going to try and do is, um, starting in that 90-90 position, you're going to take your hand and put it on your knee to just help pin it down, and then you can put some weight on that back arm. So he has his right hand on his knee, his left hand on the floor. He's going to try and lift that back leg off the ground, pull the foot all the way through. So we're going to go through external rotation of the hip and kind of bring the heels together and think about driving that top knee into the floor, almost like you're doing a butterfly stretch. Then we're going to reverse it. You're going to pick that foot back up, take the hip through internal rotation, and put the knee back behind you and get back into that 90-90 position. And we're just going to go through a couple cycles there. So very tricky. Sometimes you can just put that foot on a glider, and if you can't actually pick your foot up off the ground, you just slide it up and then slide it back down. But this is a great mobility plus activation type drill to really teach that person what hip rotation looks like and what it should feel like. So this is one that for sure people are going to be sweating a little bit as they go through. So if you've never seen this or never tried it, I recommend you playing around with it first so you kind of know what it's going to feel like before you have a client go through it, right? So we just go on each side, a couple of repetitions, really getting those hips moving dynamically. Remember, if it's too much, go back to just that 90-90 position and work on those isometric contractions there. Okay, another awesome one. So we're going to do a tennis ball squeeze and work on shoulder mobility. So let's say we did some rotator cuff stretches, maybe some internal external rotation, maybe some flexion. Maybe we were doing that three-way band stretch. And so I mentioned that if you're doing that three-way band stretch, it's kind of a static stretch. We want to make sure we're doing something to help strengthen that range of motion. So this would be a great option to do right after that. So once you've gotten some range of motion in the shoulder, let's really work on strengthening that range of motion. So you don't need a tennis ball. I like using the tennis ball because we have that connection between grip and the shoulder. So when you squeeze an object, the rotator cuff engages. It's ready to do something. So it's a great way to kind of cue the rotator cuff to engage before you even start moving. So you start with your hand, you're laying on the floor. You can do it standing. It's nice doing it on the floor because you have to work against gravity, and it's harder to compensate by moving your spine. So arms extended forward, you are going to squeeze the ball first, or if you don't have a ball, you just make a fist and squeeze it. Then you're going to drop your arms down so they're straight out to the side. The whole time you're trying not to touch the floor, if possible. Then you're going to bend the elbows, internally rotate the shoulder, and then try and bring your hands up your back as far as you can. Kind of like that athlete scratch test. We're just doing both arms at the same time. And then you're going to reach straight back out again and then overhead. And you're just going to keep cycling through that range of motion. Now, you do want to cue kind of that internal and external rotation. So you start with your palms down and you lower down. And when you hit that straight out, that T position, then you cue them to internally rotate as far as they can, bend their elbows, reach up their backs as far as they can. Now, there's a couple things you have to be mindful of. We want to make sure we're keeping the low back out of it. So make sure they're not looking up and trying to lift their chest off the ground totally, because that's just going to put a lot of pressure on the lumbar spine. They're going to keep their chest on the floor. You might put a pad under their forehead and just say, hey, you have to keep your pad here, or keep your head on the pad the whole time, so they're not lifting up at all. The other thing is pay attention to these shoulders when you're in this position. So you can kind of see that there's something going on there. I erase that so you can see. This left shoulder she's really struggling with. And what she's actually doing is kind of dumping the shoulder down to the floor. So she's running out of internal rotation. So she's going to make up for it by driving the head of the humerus into the floor. So that's never a position we want to teach somebody how to get into. You have to really cue, keeping those shoulder blades pinned together and really working on keeping it retracted as we go into internal rotation. And some people, they're barely going to be able to clear their butt as they lift up, or maybe not even. So that's okay. We only go with whatever range of motion they can get through without any of these unwanted compensations as they go through, right? So just going through those repetitions there, make sure they're breathing the entire time, never holding their breath. Okay, so I know I spent a lot of time on mobility, but I think a lot of people are caught up on that, and they do need to work on some of those things. But remember, if they have adequate mobility, you probably skipped a lot of that stuff, or you just did a little bit just to kind of more of as a warm-up and just kind of prep them for something that they're going to do, not for really enhancing more mobility. Then we're going to move on to stability. So this is more about control. I want to make sure that they either move or don't move when they are supposed to at a specific joint. So again, if we go back to that joint by joint approach, now we're looking at the other joints that we didn't talk about. And obviously, again, there are a lot more, but we're kind of picking some of the big ones where you're going to get the most bang for your buck with some of these functional patterns. So we're going to be looking at the knees, we're looking at the lumbar spine, and we're looking at the scapulothoracic, the shoulder blades now. So how the shoulder blades move on the thoracic spine. Okay, so if we're at this point, we know the hips move pretty well. We know the ankles move pretty well. If not, we continue to work on those, and we can still do these things in the meantime because we want to make sure we're teaching good movement. So when we talk about knee stability, the most common compensation that we see is that valgus collapse, where the knees are caving in. So picture somebody squatting and their knees come together, or they lunge and one knee, the front knee, just drives in instead of staying lined over the feet. So that's what we're talking about, where they've lost that stability. So if you see that happen, it could mean their hips and their ankles are just not moving. And that's the only way that they can create that movement. So that's why we spend so much time working on mobility and talking about that. But let's say we've cleared that now. We know their ankles move pretty well. We know their hips move pretty well, but they still do that because it's a pattern. They don't know any different. So now we need to do some drills to help work on that. So we want to go through different postures and positions. So we have on the floor, so we're in a supported spine position. We're going to do a single leg bridge. So now what we're working on is being able to drive into hip extension without the knee caving in. So this is a form of reactive neuromuscular training where the knee is being pulled into the bad position. So it's actually pulling you into the spot you don't want to be, which sounds backwards, but what it's going to do is you naturally correct it. You're becoming more aware of what the problem is, and now you fix it by pushing your knee back out and getting it into a better position. Another example, we can go standing in a bilateral symmetrical stance, so like a squat position, and we put a mini band above the knees, and we just go through internal and external rotation. So what we do is keeping the feet on the ground, you're going to let your knee cave in as far as you can. It's not the knee that we're focusing on, it's the hip. The femur is internally rotating, and then you're going to externally rotate it as far as you can. So it's kind of just screwing that foot into the floor back and forth. You do that a few times, and you're going to feel those hip rotators really start to engage. Okay, and then we can go into like a single leg stance posture. So now we have one foot up on a step, and again, we have that band pulling us into the bad position, and then you can do a couple things here. You could do a step up, or you could just do ankle dorsiflexion, where you just push your knee forward, kind of like that stretch that we were talking about earlier. And you make sure that the band doesn't pull you in. So it's actually teaching you how to dorsiflex the ankle without driving the knee in. So if you see somebody when they're doing their ankle mobility drills and that knee keeps caving in, you might want to try something like this. Tie that band to their knee and bring some awareness of what they're doing so now they can pull back and do their ankle dorsiflexion at the same time. So all great examples of improving knee stability. Okay, then we have lumbar stability. So this is core training, essentially. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but just some things that we need to be aware of. Again, we want to take the body through different postures, different movements, and make sure the core is not moving, right? So that's the whole point here. The lumbar spine is staying stable while other things may be moving. Now, we might start just statically, and that's a lot of what we see in these pictures here. So we might have our feet in a TRX and we're just holding a plank, or we're just holding a regular plank. We're just doing something to challenge that extension posture, right? We don't want the spine to go into extension, but I want to challenge you so you feel it trying to pull you, but you are strong enough not to let it happen, right? Or it could be holding a bridge position, and again, trying to maintain good alignment. We have the knee, the hip, the shoulder, all staying in a nice straight line. Okay, and then in this last picture with the feet on the wall, a couple great progressions you can go through. But what this is trying to do is actually create a little compressive force in the spine. And I know when we hear compressive force in spine, that sounds like a terrible thing, but we're talking just minimal compressive forces, because when you compress a joint, it's kind of like when I was saying with the rotator cuff, when you squeeze a ball, the rotator cuff, so our deep shoulder stabilizers engage. So another way to get your deep stabilizers to engage is to apply pressure to a joint. So if we compress the spine, the deep muscles, the ones that you can't really just engage by consciously thinking about it. So like the pelvic floor and the multifidi and things like that, it's hard to just say, hey, I'm going to contract these muscles, but when you create compressive forces, it actually helps with that. So you use the wall to help do that. Now you can actually start on all fours, so knees are on the ground, toes are on the ground, but your heels are in the wall. Then you just have your hands out in front of your shoulders a little bit in that all four position, and you just push your heels into the wall to create a little bit of compressive force to engage that deep core. Then you can progress there by lifting your knees off the ground slightly, right, and just holding that position like you had a glass of water on your back. Then you start to walk your hands out so you're kind of in a push-up position with your still toes on the ground, heels against the wall, and you just push. And then finally, you can start to walk your heels up the wall. Now it's just making it more of a total body challenge and still maintaining that lumbar spine position. And you can even add a push-up or something like that if you're just trying to progress along there. All right, some other great options. So here we have a supported spine position. So whenever you're supported, it's going to be the easiest and a great place to start, right? We're just teaching you, hey, we're going to help you out a little bit by using a floor or bench or something like that. Now, we're going to do dead bugs with the band because this is another way to create that stability. When you pull that band tight, so let's just imagine there's a lot of tension in that band and it's trying to pull her arms back, but she's not going to let it happen. That is going to naturally engage that core. So I don't have to tell you to squeeze your abs. You're already doing it, just staying in this position. Now it's harder to screw up, which is a great place to start for people. You want them to be successful. So now they walk one foot out in full extension without losing that hip position or that spine position, and they walk back in. So we have that core stability while we're marching now and adding a little bit of hip mobility there. And the whole time we're just breathing. Here's another one, and this we're kind of combining a few things here. So remember, we did that active hip flexor exercise earlier where you're laying on your back and you were doing that hip stretch and then you let go of your arms and engage the hip flexor. This is just, it's adding a little bit more of a challenge to it, and we're really emphasizing core stability at the same time. So this is a hip flexor activation drill, but it's also a core stability exercise. So now, again, you're just trying to get multiple things done at the same time so I don't have to do a million exercises to work on some of these things. So we start in the plank position. So make sure they understand what a good high plank from the hands position would be. And then we have a glider underneath your toe. Now, the type of surface that you have will influence how hard something is going to be. So just make sure if you're on a smooth surface like carpet, it's going to make it a lot easier. And if you're on a floor like a rubber floor like we see here, then it's going to make it a little bit more friction, make it a little bit harder. So all you're going to do is drive that toe into the floor as hard as you can, and then slide your knee up to your chest. And while you do this, you're going to make sure that there's no movement in that lumbar spine. So imagine that we put like a glass of water right here on her back. As we're doing this, that glass of water won't move at all. The problem that most people run into is as they go through hip flexion, they naturally go through lumbar flexion at the same time. So we're going to see a lot of movement there. So maintain that neutral spine as they go through hip flexion. If they're really struggling, what you have to do for some people is limit their range of motion. They might only get their knee to like 90 degrees at first. That's okay. right? We're going to do whatever range of motion they can keep holding that core position. Okay, and then doing anti-rotational movements as well are great lumbar spine stability exercises. So we have just a couple different variations here. You've probably seen some of these, like a anti-rotational hold. So you have a band tied off to the side, and then you're just pressing straight out. Now you can press and come back, press and come back. Just realize that's just giving them rest. So sometimes I like to keep it out there and hold it and just breathe and make them hold it for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds. So we work on some of that endurance there. You'll see too, I'm just going to highlight it, the band here. This is for that person that's really struggling with anti-rotation. So when they press out, you see the knees kind of being pulled in because they're having a really hard time keeping the hips stable. So we use this band to engage the hips so they're more likely to stay straight. So their hips, the ASIS, that front of the hip, the pelvis is pointing straight forward the entire time. So you don't want to be using a ton of bands, but sometimes this just works really well to keep the hips aligned. Once they get something like that, you can add like a hop. Now this is really difficult. As soon as your feet leave the ground, you have no more connection to the ground, obviously, and it's going to pull you in. So these are baby hops, and it's very minimal tension, right? We're just trying to engage and then come back down. Little kind of bunny hops there. Or we might add like a shuffle where they're going to shuffle out away from the wall and then come back in. And they just kind of shuffle back and forth. Again, making sure they're not allowing any rotation to occur. And that's the key with all of these. No rotation should be occurring. If there is rotation, we need to take a step back and make it easier, less tension, whatever it might be there. Okay, and then scapula stability. So just making sure that they are feeling some of those scapular muscles and they understand that the scapula has to move in order to stabilize the shoulder joint. A lot of times people kind of just pull their shoulders back and don't allow any movement there, right? The scapula needs to protract, retract, upwardly rotate, downwardly rotate, elevate, depress, right? It goes through all these different ranges of motion. So we can do a couple of drills to just work on that. The floor slide or a wall slide is a great example. So just pushing, so laying on the floor and then just pushing your hands into the ground and you just slide all the way up and then you slide all the way back down. Trying to keep your hands on the ground without arching your back. And that's the big thing. We start to see ribs pop up off the ground. That's a sign that they are having an issue, probably with shoulder mobility, and they probably shouldn't have their hands on the ground. So you can elevate them a little bit and at the same time work on some shoulder mobility there. As they're doing this, they're focusing on upward and downward rotation, which should really occur naturally. If they start to feel the muscles between their shoulder blades working, there's a good sign that they're doing it right there. All right, and then any of our PNF patterns, so our diagonal patterns are going to be great here. So we're not just working on scapular stability, we're working on rotator cuff stability and glenohumeral movement all in one. So this is just a great example. So here we have a half kneeling PNF pattern, so that diagonal pattern where the arm will actually start up here and then we pull it down. So whenever the arm is reaching up, we're going to have our palm up because we're in external rotation, and then as we move down, it's going to go into internal rotation. So we can have the band up high pulling us down. We can switch legs and have the band low and pulling up high. So there's all the different progressions and variations of our PNF pattern here. Okay. I spent a lot of time talking on mobility and stability, but that is the baseline which we are going to build our movement patterns on. So we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about our different movement patterns. And now they have a much better opportunity to even get in the positions that we're hoping for. So we're going to go through all the different movements. So our squats, our lunges, our deadlifts, our pushing, our pulling, going through all of these and looking at what are the most common compensations that occur, and then giving you some drill compensations. So that's the goal. Because, unfortunately, just because we've range of motion, we've improved stability, we've done all of these cool things, Just because we've done that doesn't mean that they will naturally squat better. They will naturally lunge better. Now we have to coach. Now we have to actually give instruction and drills to really reinforce what it should feel like and what it should look like. And this is the kind of the art and science of coaching and making sure that they are understanding what you're asking of them in the first place. Right, whether I'm working with a average population client, general population, they're just trying to move, feel better, or I'm working with an elite athlete, they all need to be able to do these fundamental patterns before we lay any specific complex skill on top of it. Okay, so I just wanted to give you some steps and kind of take you through my thought process with applying some of these remedial exercises, right? We want to make it easy before we add complexity, and there's some different ways we can do that. What we absolutely know that if there's a compensation and it's not eliminated, injuries are going to be more common, right? And they're not going to understand how they should be moving in the first place. So you have to understand the compensations, and we have to understand how to eliminate them. And it could be going all the way back to mobility. They just don't have the appropriate range of motion. But once we identify these compensations, now let's try some drills and see if we can correct it. So we already shown that maybe they move well, their mobility is pretty good, so they should be able to get into this position, but they're still not. Okay, so identify what the compensation is. Then I'm going to apply some drill. So what are some options that I can do? I can do RNT, and I'll explain more of that reactive neuromuscular training that I've already talked about a little bit. We'll give a couple ideas on that. I might decrease loading, so making something easier, or it could be removing body parts, which will make sense in a second, but I'm going to essentially regress into the simplest form of that exercise that I can think of. Because if I just think of weight, let's just say I have somebody doing lunges, for example, and they're holding some dumbbells at their side and it doesn't look great, or maybe it's causing pain in their knees. Then I get rid of the dumbbells and they do the lunge just with body weight, and they say it maybe just looks better. It's like, hey, that's a lot better. Or maybe it's like better but not great. And then I give them handles like we see here with the TRX or some type of suspension trainer. And now they do a lunge and it looks perfect and no pain at all. Great range of motion. So what did that tell you? It told you that they can do the movement. They probably don't have the strength yet to do it the way you were hoping they could do it. So we have to, progress, baby steps. So now we start here, and I'm going to teach you, hey, you need to nail down this type of lunge, holding on, and they might want to regress faster, but as soon as they grab those dumbbells or let go of the straps, we see all the bad compensations come back. So you have to be careful not to allow them to progress too quickly. I mentioned improved mobility, so that's going back, if their mobility is restricting them, there's no way around it. You're going to have to go back and keep working on that, or reduce range of motion of an exercise until they've gotten proper mobility there. And then the ultimate idea is get rid of the drill that we're doing. I want to get rid of the TRX. I want to get rid of the bands. I want you to do lunges or squats or whatever it is. Sometimes people feel like these are all permanent things, right? These are just temporary for a lot of people. Now, for some people, this might be the best you're going to get. So if I want to do a lunge, the only way I can do it is by doing it holding on to something. All right, but the ultimate goal is we get rid of all this stuff so they can just do their lunges, do their squats. Okay, so I mentioned RNT, rapid neuromuscular training. So I just want to at least explain a little bit more of what it is, even though I kind of already talked about it, just so you have ideas on how you can incorporate it to help fix some of these issues that you might see. So once we identify a compensation, we might use this to help us out to create a remedy. What it's going to do is really, it creates awareness, like I mentioned before. If somebody's doing a push-up and their hips are just sagging the whole time, they probably don't know that's happening. It's not like they thought, hey, I want to do push-ups and really poorly and just let my butt sag and my hips sag and do my push-ups that way. It just feels like how they're supposed to do push-ups to them. And I might say, like, your hips up or engage your core or do whatever, and they still don't get it. So I'm going to do something to get them to be aware of what they're doing. So for example, you could put a weight on their back or push them down a little bit more. Now this, again, you're going to actually force them into the bad position, which I know sounds backwards, but what they naturally do is they correct it. So they're going to start to lift their hips up on their own, which they all of a sudden, now they understand what it feels like. So they're like, oh, that's what you want my core to do while I'm doing push-ups. Well, this is going to result in accelerated motor learning, because now it wasn't like me teaching and explaining something to them. They figured it out on their own. Anytime you figure something out on your own, whatever type of skill it is, it will stick way better versus me having to hold your hand the whole way. I'm just giving you a little bit of feedback. You're going to interpret that feedback and naturally fix the problem. So we force the individual to fire the muscles appropriately and to engage the right muscles. So we often hear the term, feeding the compensation. So if you see a movement you don't like, make it a little bit worse as long as you feel safe doing so, and so they understand it. And now it gives them a little bit of feedback too, because if I have maybe a light sandbag on their back and they felt it pushing their hips down, I can say, I need you to push that up. You need to push your hips into the sandbag, and they naturally engage their core. So I don't have to go through an anatomy lesson with them and understand and explain what different muscles are. I just tell them to focus on an action and do it. And it's amazing how much faster they learn these things. Okay, so here's just an example, kind of like we were talking about. Let's say if we look at a plank, and they're in a plank position and they keep sagging, and you try and get them to lift their hips up, but they're just not doing a good job with it. You put, for example, here we have a weighted bag. We put it on their back, and now I say, don't let that bag push you down, and all of a sudden their hips go up. Maybe I have the opposite. Maybe their butt's going way up in the air. So now they're doing their planks or their push-ups, and the hips are too high. So I know it's hard to see in the picture. I'll highlight it. This is a band that's just attached to a pull-up bar. So what's it doing? If the band is pulling them up, it's actually trying to get them into that bad posture. Now they have feedback. So what I can say is, I need you to pull that band tight. As soon as I say that, they naturally bring their hips down into a perfect plank position. Right? So these are just a couple of examples of R&T. So as you're going through and you see something you don't like out of a movement, see, is there a way you can add this to correct that movement pattern? Okay, so let's go through our big movements and let's focus on some of the big compensations. Obviously, we're not going to go through all of them, but I want to at least cover some of our bigger ones here. So deadlifting, we've all seen a picture like this, and you explain over and over again, you want them to do a hip hinge and they just don't get it, and they're rounding their back and doing all sorts of other things. So that could be an example. So that's that improper hip hinge. They just don't get what a hip hinge is. It could be squatting versus the deadlifting, which is essentially the same thing. They don't understand how to hip hinge. They know how to squat. So they're going to try and squat everything instead of deadlift it. And then a lot of times it's the shoulder. They don't understand that the shoulder and the hips are connected. And if one's not connected, they're going to be less effective, less strong in this position. So we need to engage the shoulder girdle as well. So I want to go over a couple drills that we can use to improve our deadlifting. So I mentioned removing body parts or decreasing load. You can look at this different ways. So what if we take the legs out of it a little bit more, right? Because the less muscles and the less joints involved, the easier it is to focus on the problem. So if we remove the lower body and we just focus on the hips, I can do a tall kneeling hip hinge. So all this is really, it's just teaching somebody how to bend at the hips. So all they do is they get up in a nice tall position, and then they just sit their butt back, and then they sit up nice and tall again. So it should look, if you're only looking at their hips and their upper body, it would look exactly like a deadlift. So we're just trying to teach them that hip hinge position. Now you can add weight. He could be holding dumbbells in his hands and add a little bit of resistance to this so he feels it a little bit more, again, trying to create a little bit of awareness. And we can use bands like you see in the picture. That band is pulling him into hip flexion. So now he's going to have to drive the hips into hip extension so he really feels that position there. So removing body parts is a great place to start. And then basically the same thing. We're going to start standing, or now we're going to go standing, because now we need to reteach you the same exercise just with the feet involved now. And now we're going to do the wall kiss. So you're going to stand about a foot away from the wall, and you're going to reach back until your butt lightly kisses the wall, and then stands back up. Now you have to make sure they're not just falling back and using the wall as a support, just kissing and coming back up. This is the one where if they're the squatter, where they just bend their knees and drive their knees forward, this is a great drill because if they try and do that, they're not gonna be able to touch the wall. They're just gonna keep lowering their hips down, right? So squats and deadlifts sometimes look similar, but that's the big difference. The hips are going back, and that's what we need to understand with the hip hinge. Making sure, if I draw a line right here, that tibia should maintain that vertical position. If we see the tibia, sorry, my lines are not very straight, driving forward, now we're squatting, right? So that would look like your squat position, like that. Which is fine if I'm trying to squat, but when I'm trying to deadlift, we want to make sure we're bowing, and I'm just not a good drawer. I am sorry, right? But we have that hip extension versus the knee extension there. Right? Hopefully you can make sense of all of that and driving up through the hips there. So the wall kiss is a great drill to help teach that hip hinge. Okay, and then I mentioned the shoulder girdle. So the lats are critical when we're talking about deadlifting. The lats is probably our biggest core muscle. Now, when the lats engage, it will allow the glutes to engage more effectively. So we've all probably heard of kind of that connection, the shoulder and opposite hip. This is what we see. We see the lats that go right across to the thoracolumbar fascia, which go right across to the opposite glute. So when you engage the lat, the glutes automatically engage. So it creates more stability throughout the whole system, meaning your core stays more stable, and you keep your shoulders in a better position. A lot of people just reach with their shoulders and they go right into protraction and they round their upper back, and that causes obviously a lot of issues when you try deadlifting. So here are a couple really simple drills you can do when you're working on deadlifts. So let me go to the picture on the right first. So before we even pick up a weight, we use bands. So they tie a band off to something in front of them, and then they pull the bands to their hips. And then they just slide their hands down towards about halfway down their shin, and then they just stand back up. So they understand the hip hinge. They understand to push the hips back. Now we're just teaching them to keep the lats engaged and the shoulders engaged. So again, this is that natural thing. I don't have to tell them to engage their lats. They will do it as long as their arms, their hands are close to their shins as they go down. Once you're ready to pick something up, but you still want them to have a little bit of feedback as they go, we can go to the picture on the left. So maybe we're going to try a kettlebell deadlift here. And what we're going to do is take 2 towels and put them under your armpits. Now, the whole idea is you have to deadlift without those towels falling out. So again, it's just a great way to naturally engage the lats while we're using the hips. So the lats are stabilizing and the hips are driving the movement. So this is personally a go-to exercise when I first teach a deadlift, to teach them how the shoulders should stay stable while the hips do the big movement. A couple other things we can do. So let's just say it was a mobility issue. So you know what? They just don't have great mobility yet. Then we need to reduce range of motion, because if they can't get to the floor and pick up that weight, they're going to compensate. And I don't want to teach them bad habits. So let's reduce range of motion while we still deadlift, while we are working on mobility at the same time. So you're going to do your mobility work at home every day. And when we come in here to work out, you're going to do a modified deadlift. So we're going to use a step or a box or whatever we need to and pick the weight up off of there. This is what I do. My oldest client right now is 97 years old, and we deadlift, but we do it like this. I take a 12-inch box and I put a kettlebell on top of it. He stands over it and he picks it up from that position, because that's what I feel comfortable with him range of motion wise with his hip hinge. And he can keep great form as he pushes his hips back, he picks up that weight, and then he puts it back down, and then he picks it back up. So that's a great option when I want to deadlift, but I don't feel confident in their range of motion yet. And for him, we're always going to do it. I wish I can say I'm going to get him to reach down and touch his toes, but at his age and what he's, where he currently is, it's just not going to happen. But I can safely still do the exercise with him. The picture on the right, this is another great way to not necessarily, it's not reducing range of motion, but we're helping with that hip hinge. If you elevate somebody's toes slightly, it forces their hips to go back. So this is just a kind of like using the wall. It's another great teaching tool that we can have a client use, perform your deadlifts on here, because it forces you in that right position. So it's kind of one of those ones that it's just really hard to screw it up. All right, and here's just an example, again, providing feedback where we're doing a kettlebell swing, so we're still doing a hip hinge exercise. But a lot of people, they still lose that shoulder connection, so they're not engaging the lats. So I could have them squeeze towels under their arms here. That'll still work. Or a lot of times they keep going too low, and that kettlebell is pulling too hard, and it's going to get into their lower back if they're not careful. So we give them feedback. So I put a mini band below their knees, kind of. Everyone's going to be slightly different depending on how tall they are, and that's our feedback. So now when you swing, you can't go below that band. So it's, again, just a great way to teach a good hip hinge, so they're not going into flexion during a swing. They have to keep the weight above that band the whole time. Okay, so let's move on to squatting now. So obviously tons of compensations that can come up here. So we can start with, rounding of the lower back. We see a little bit of that in this picture here. Excessive leaning forward, that's, again, what we see in the picture here as well. So now it's almost like they're trying to deadlift instead of squat. Or we see that knee valgus position where those knees start to collapse in. So we've identified some compensations, so what are we going to do about it? First up, can we remove body parts? Can we decrease load? And absolutely. So we can decrease load here. You take a band and you wrap it around underneath their arms. That band is actually going to help them get up. So now they have to actually pull themselves to the floor, which is a great teaching tip as well. It teaches them you don't just sit back into a squat. You have to pull your hips down. So you have to engage those hip flexors. And then the band helps you get back up. So this might actually help them get a little more range of motion than they're normally used to by giving them a little bit of support there. We can use some more R&T and just, again, other feedback tools to help them out. So the excessive leaning, the first picture, so we're doing a step up or a single leg squat there, but we can use it for, double leg squat as well. Having a weight out in front of you by using light dumbbells, using a kettlebell, a sandbag, something like that, because if you let the band, let the weight pull you forward, you're just going to fall forward. So you naturally have to lean back. So again, that's that R&T where I'm going to make you lean even more forward by giving you a weight, so you naturally get up taller as you do your squat. Same thing with the bands, so tying the bands off to a wall and then wrapping them around the shoulders. So just think that band's pulling you forward and you have to fight it. Or doing kind of the suspension squat. So now we have two bands across the shoulders pulling you forward a little bit. You're going to have to stay tall and then drive out of that bottom position and stretch the bands out. So a couple different ways that we can work on the excessive leaning. My go-to here is just having a weight out in front of you, whether it's like a kettlebell goblet squat or a front raise as you squat with a light weight, or even a press out with a light plate or something like that. Okay, here's another way, just giving them feedback. So have them squat. They probably don't want to go right up against the wall to start. And we can do an overhead squat. So we're just putting them in a more challenging position and basically say, I want you to squat down as low as you can and don't touch the wall. So it's, again, easy. Do this at home because you don't need me there to tell you that you did it wrong. You touched the wall, right? So any drills that they know when it's right or wrong is going to be extremely appropriate for home use because they know exactly how to do it correctly. So you just squat down, sitting back without touching the wall. Okay, we can do some exercises too. Again, removing body parts, giving them more support. So this is one, it's just, I mentioned the hip flexors. So if they are having a hard time controlling the pelvis as they go into a squat, they're getting kind of that butt wink or going into a posterior pelvic tilt, they're not actively pulling themselves down. They're just relying on the quads to do everything and not relying on their core to help stabilize as they go through. So here, what we do is you have your feet up on a ball, and that's really just to give them a little bit of support, and then you tie bands around your feet, and then you just roll the ball in so you're pulling your knees towards your chest. So if I were to take this picture on the right and rotate it counterclockwise 90 degrees, what would it look like she's doing? She'd be in a squat. So we're just making it easier for you to teach the movement pattern of the squat while we help give you some stability. So again, just a great way to teach some hip flexion activation, some core stability, and just seeing kind of how much range of motion you can get through. So this is what I like doing before we actually squat, so they can kind of see how this feels. Ask them if they feel those hip flexors engaging, and then when they stand up and try and squat, I want them to copy that. I want them to get the same feeling in their hip flexors as they go down into a squat. Okay, sometimes we just have to give them as much of an advantage as possible. So doing a box squat is helpful in general. It just gives them a little bit of feedback of how low they should be getting or you want them to go. But the other benefit here is we elevate the heels. So this definitely gets abused. The goal is not to see how much you can squat with your heels elevated. This is trying to reteach a better squat mechanics. And when we elevate your heels, if you have limited ankle range of motion, it's going to help you. You'll be able to squat a lot deeper. And this also helps you, it changes your center of gravity a little bit, just making it easier to squat. So we're trying to teach you what that bottom of a squat position feels like, getting through enough hip flexion and knee flexion and then getting out of it. And until you get there, you don't know what it feels like. So we give you a little bit of a cheat in order to get there. Now, kind of like that deadlift off the box, I don't want to be here forever. So this is just to help you learn how to squat, and how I often start squatting with many people while we might be working on ankle range of motion and core stability. But eventually I want to get rid of this. The goal is not to now throw a barbell on your back because you have a hard time squatting and see how much you can squat there. And that's what a lot of people do. You see them put the plates under their heels and they start barbell back squatting, when instead we should use this as a teaching tool to get a better squat and then get rid of it and start and learn how to squat better before you start loading it up. And that's just a common mistake people make. So correct the pattern versus strengthening with a crutch attached to it. So some people, this is how they will squat forever if we're doing it in terms of exercise and trying to build some strength there. Other people, we just do this for a week or two just to kind of learn the mechanics, and then we challenge them with a harder drill from there. So again, that's kind of, again, where the art of coaching comes in and knowing how to progress somebody through. Okay, let's go into lunging. So again, lots of compensations that might occur here. One, incomplete range of motion. So they're just not getting that knee to the floor at all. Too big of a step. That's kind of what we see in this picture here. So just, and that might just be as simple as, hey, don't step so big. Step a little bit smaller. Put a piece of tape on the floor so they have an idea. But the idea is that knee should be pretty much under your hip. If I step this far, just think, what's being stretched right now? So yes, your hip flexor, right? How many people have tight hip flexors that you work with? Like all of them, right? So if they have a tight hip flexor, it means that their hip extension's probably not that good. And what's your hip doing on the left side right now? It's extending, and it's extending way more than that person probably can do, which means you're not hip extending, your lumbar spine extending. So this is an important one, just making sure they're taking an appropriate step, right? And if it's too big anyway, you're relying on kind of the bounce and the stretch of the muscle versus the strength of the muscle. So just try it out. Now you can go too small, obviously, but take smaller steps so when you are in that down position, the knee is pretty much right underneath your hip, and see how that changes the whole movement. You'll be surprised. And then we also have upper body compensation. So when you do a lunge, the legs and the upper body should be doing two different things. The legs are moving, creating that movement, and the upper body should be stabilized. A lot of times you see people kind of hunch over and bow and push off that front knee, and they just can't control that core and create separate movement. They're trying to move everything at the same time, which we want to avoid. Okay, so we kind of talked about an easy way to start to correct this. So for example, if it's the too big of a step, here we see a little bit better picture. So that front foot is just slightly in front of the back knee. There's still a little bit of hip flexion there, so we could probably take slightly a bigger step, but just to kind of see what I'm talking about there. So we have the shoulders, hips, and knee in a fairly straight stacked position. Then how do we reduce load? So the band right here is a great option. So when you step forward, do a forward lunge with a band pulling you back, it actually takes body weight away. So this is a great way to just teach somebody the range of motion. So if they really struggle with doing lunges, body weight lunges even, try with a band and see if you can help them out. And you can even try with a suspension trainer, right? Holding, or just a pole, hold on to something and do your lunges that way. And all of a sudden, does it look really good? Okay, we just knew body weight was too much. You're not ready to do your own body weight yet, so let's do lighter than that. And we're going to progress as you get stronger and stronger. All right, you've seen this already. It's the same thing. So now with lunging, you can see we're a lot closer. Now, you can do it in that overhead position. There's a couple variations we can do, but with the lunging and squatting are a little bit different. With a squat, your knees do have to go forward. And I know sometimes we hear like, don't let the knees go past the toes. Don't think of it as a black and white line. Some people, their knees do need to go past their toes. We're all biomechanically different, so we need to give them the best opportunity to do the movement right. So if the knee goes past past the toe slightly, it might still be okay. That's why when we did the squat, you want to back up a little bit. You're not going to be right up against the wall, although some people can squat that way, but we're just trying to help them out a little bit here. With the lunge, though, you can maintain a much taller position now that we're in that split stance, and the knee should not be traveling that far forward. So you can have that toe right up against the wall. Now here we're doing reverse lunges, so she's just stepping her left foot back, tapping the knee on the ground or as close as she can, and then coming back up. Now, you can start by providing some support. So hold on to the wall the whole time, and that helps them out. And then eventually we can get rid of that wall, or get rid of the holding. The wall's still there to provide some feedback, and they just stand up and then step back. But it's always there just in case they need it to reach out for. So this might be a great way to give them a little bit of feedback if you see that knee drifting a little bit too far forward when they do their lunges. Here we have basically the same thing. We're just progressing it a little bit more, taking a foam roller, and this might be, you can do this at home if they have a foam roller, but you're going to just say, don't knock over the roller. So you're going to do a reverse lunge again, and just take a step back, stand back up. And you can see in this picture, we're actually adding a glider, which I love sliding lunges because it teaches them, hey, we really are going to focus on that front leg when we do a reverse lunge. So you're just going to slowly slide down and then stand back up, and then nice and easy slide back down again. So all while not touching that foam roller. Okay, another great one. So we're doing a couple different things here. If they have a hard time, they aren't using their core. They tend to round forward, and even if they tend to not be able to get all the way to the floor, this is one of those kind of magic ones that seems to correct everything all at once, and you don't really have to tell them anything except for keep your arms straight out in front of you. So we tie a band. It can't be too heavy, otherwise their upper body won't be strong enough to hold it, but strong enough that they feel it. They pull down so their arms are straight out. So we'll start the picture on the right. That's our starting position, just holding that band straight out. Then we're going to do a reverse lunge. So we're going to step back with the right leg, but you need to keep your hands straight out in front of you. So you can see in both pictures, her hands are straight out. The band is about aligned with her chest. And then you just stand back up. So what you're going to feel is when you go down, you have to stay tall, right, to stay in this position. So you can't round forward. It makes it a lot harder to, at least. You're going to feel the core engage. So the abs are going to light up as we go into that bottom position. Then as the band is stretching, it's actually helping you. So it makes it easier to get that knee all the way to the ground. So it helps engage the core so we stay more upright and have less upper body involvement. And it helps us get deeper into that squat if they don't have the strength maybe in the lower body or just maybe confidence to do it yet, so they have a little bit of support. And then the nice thing is now that the band's stretched, when you want to stand up, the band pulls you back up. So you just kind of bounce right back up. So this is doing a lot of things at once, but it's a great way for some to at least just warm up lunges. For others, this might be how they do their lunges until they're ready to progress without support. All right, and another way, if you have that client that just tends to use their upper body too much and they're rounding every time they step forward and it becomes more of a lower back exercise than a leg exercise, you might just want to give them some feedback with a dowel rod. You take a dowel rod, you put it behind their back, and you just make sure it's touching their head, their shoulder blades, and their sacrum. Maintaining those 3 points of contact, they do a forward lunge or a side lunge, however you're doing lunges, walking lunges, and you have to make sure they maintain 3 points of contact. And they typically can feel when they're losing one. Sometimes you have to come in and let them know that, hey, it's not touching your hips anymore, or now it's not touching your head, whatever it might be. And you just give them a little bit of feedback so they keep that tall posture the whole time. Okay, moving into our pushing exercise, and we're primarily going to talk about push-ups here. With this one, what could be going on? So we see the worm, right? So this is where they've lost the connection between the upper and the lower body. So this push-ups are amazing core exercises. They are teaching you to bridge the gap between your hands and feet. So you're creating that connection with the floor with the hands and feet, and then you're pushing up without the back moving from that position. We might have increased lordotic. That's sometimes kind of the same thing. We usually see when the chest comes up and then the legs come up, that's the exact posture you're going into. But sometimes we just have people start in a bad neutral spine, where they're not in neutral spine, they're kind of in that anterior pelvic tilt. So we have to make sure they understand what a plank is and get them in a good pelvis position while they're doing their push-ups. And then sometimes we just have the hand positions off. One common one is the hands are just too far out in front of them. That's just going to put a lot of stress on the shoulder, and now you're turning it almost into a neck and upper trap exercise, which obviously we don't want to focus on those areas with our push-ups. So if I take that last one first, so here we can do some RNT for shoulder stability. So this is basically giving them feedback, because if you do it wrong, you know. Now, sure, these are a little bit more high-risk exercises, but if you feel comfortable doing it, these are great options. So the picture on the left, we're basically just holding a plank for both of these exercises. That's a slide board. So your hands are on the booties, and you're going to make sure your hands are right underneath your shoulders. Because what happens if your hands creep out in front of you too far, you're going to slide and you're going to fall straight down. So I want you to learn how to keep your hands under your shoulders and hold a plank. And then from there, we can do some marching. You're just going to lift one foot off the ground, lift the other foot off the ground, and just show me that, hey, your core is stabilizing your body, not your shoulders. And that's usually what the problem is. Their core is not strong enough to do this, so they're going to compensate and try and use their shoulders more and creep those arms out in front of them. Right? So this is not letting them do that. And then you can eventually do push-ups here if you wanted to progress that far. The picture on the right is if you don't have a slide board, that's on a foam roller. Right? So now you can have your hands on a foam roller. If you creep out too far, you're just going to, again, slip off the roller and fall down. And we can go through our same progressions where we're marching or even doing push-ups if we feel comfortable doing that. Okay, some other things. We can reduce load, and this is usually where we start, right? So the first one was just kind of teaching good hand position. But if we're going to correct that push-up, let me look at, if I make it easier for you, does it naturally clean it up? If it does, then we just progress too quickly. So a little bit harder to see in these pictures, but here we're using the band as like a slingshot. And they make products called slingshots that you just put through your arms, and then there's a band going across your chest, and now you do push-ups. Because when you go down, assuming your hands and elbows are going in a good position, the band stretches across your chest and it pushes you right back up. So it takes away that body load. This might be an easier setup. So now we have the band attached to a pull-up bar, and it's around the hips. So when you go down, it actually helps you. It takes away some weight, and it helps you engage that core a little bit better. So this would be a perfect way to increase core stability as you're doing your push-ups and by taking away some load there. Okay, some other options is just going on an incline. I know nothing too exciting there, but this is where most people are going to start. So my preference is always push-ups on your toes when possible. Push-ups on your knees it's a different exercise. It's harder to keep a good alignment when you do it, but I know sometimes that's your best option. So you might not be able to have enough bars set up or benches or whatever it might be for people to do it. But when possible, opt for the incline push-up, like on a squat rack or a Smith machine or a countertop or whatever it is, and just making sure they understand what that straight alignment is, and they can maintain so the bottom position and the top position look identical. Another correction we might do here with the RX pad. So remember I talked about, well, what if they have an increased lordotic curve, right? They're in that anterior pelvic tilt. we have to work on some planks first to help, right? They have to understand what a posterior pelvic tilt is. This is just an easy way to get them there when they may not understand that pelvic tilt. Because you can absolutely just take them to pelvic tilts. Go anterior, posterior, and then have them stop in the posterior. Now do your push-ups, now do your plank. Here, when you squeeze that Airex pad between your legs and get the adductors, we're going to get the deep core stabilizers as well, and they usually naturally go right into a posterior pelvic tilt. So now they're nice and stable, and they will have an easier time actually doing their push-ups that way. So that might be a good option for them. Okay, going into our rows now, so our pulling exercises, common compensations. So we can see a loss of neutral spine, so kind of like we see in the picture here. We have the elbow reaching too far behind the body and losing shoulder stability. We can see locked scapula where they just don't understand that scapula stability like we talked about. So these are some of the big compensations that we can address. All right, so a couple things that I'll start with. The dead stop rows, that's the pictures on the left, right? So we set up just like we're going to do a normal one-arm bent over row on a bench or a box or whatever it might be. But every rep, you have to start and stop on the ground. So this is going to make sure they're not changing body position. So a lot of times when people row, they start to stand up a little bit. And now they wouldn't be able to reach the floor. So it just kind of keeps you honest. So now if you started on the ground, we go through a good rowing movement, and then you finish on the ground, right? So that's just going to keep us in a good alignment the entire time. Another one of the compensations I talked about was this elbow going too far behind you. So the more you reach that elbow back, the more it pushes the head of the humerus down. So really, I think for most people, keep it in line with their torso. So yes, it's going to reduce the range of motion, but we're keeping them in a better position. So that's about as far back as they need to go. You can still retract the shoulder, squeeze the scapula, and get everything you need to get out of it while keeping low risk movement on the shoulder. Moving to the picture on the right, we have our wide stance rows. So when we're in this wide stance, and you need to exaggerate that, it's like an adductor stretch. We want to get as wide as possible. It makes it pretty much impossible to turn the hips now. So if the hips are stable, it means the lumbar spine is going to be much more likely to be stable. So this is going to create great core control, much more alignment in the spine and the hips as we do our row. And then eventually you can move that leg in as they get the hang of it. But this is a great way to control that neutral spine. Another good thing to do is, a lot of times with the row, we talk about the rowing hand, right? So this arm here. What about this arm? This is where we're getting stability from. So really think about driving that hand into the ground. That keeps your shoulder stable. It's going to keep your spine stable as well. Another great trick to get the core involved a little bit more, taking two boxes or two benches, put them so your knees and hands are split on two boxes, and then you row in between. That's really it. It's kind of one of those cool ones. Just try it if you've never done this before. You have no choice but to feel everything working right here. So now we have better core stability as we work on our rowing exercise. Okay, and our rotations. So I'm not going to spend too much on rotations, but the big thing here is they need to be able to understand hip and T-spine rotation. So as we start in this picture on the left, you can see feet are pointing forward, knees are pointing forward, hips are pointing forward, gaze is forward. So everything's pointing forward. The only thing that's rotating to start is the shoulders and the thoracic spine. Now when we start our rotation and pull across, we have our finish position. So most of the rotation is occurring from the thoracic spine and the hips. These are our two big spots. So in order for this to happen, we need a bend at the knee and we need to pivot this foot. So now it is no longer pointing forward. That heel has to come off the ground. If they don't pivot this foot, just think what happens to this knee right here. If your foot's pointing forward and your knee's pointing this way, right? That's a terrible position to get that knee into. So with rotation, we want good stability where we should have stability, like the knee, like the lumbar spine, and good mobility where we should have mobility, like the hips and thoracic spine. So just make sure we're really emphasizing where the rotation comes from. This is the big thing right here. That foot needs to pivot. I exaggerate. I want your heel to face this wall over here. that's how far I want you to pivot, because I know that means you just rotated your hip internally, which is exactly what I want. And then you finish it with thoracic. So if they don't get, we talked about that anti-rotation exercises, kind of presses and hops and things like that. Make sure they've understood that concept, how not to rotate, before we introduce any rotational exercises, because they're really going to struggle if they don't have adequate control of their body there. Okay, so what's next? You want to be checking your work consistently. So making sure, hey, did these remedial exercises and these regressions that we brought in, did they make a difference? Can they squat now? Can they deadlift better? Is their mobility increasing? So as you went through your different assessments and screens and things like that, see, did they get better? If mobility was their issue, what was their baseline, right? Where did they start? Take pictures so they can see, hey, this is what your hip mobility looked like when we first started. Here's where it looks now. Obviously, we're working in the right direction and we're progressing. May not be perfect yet, but you build some confidence that, hey, what we're doing is working. I'm proving it with these pictures. You hopefully can feel it. The exercises are getting better, and let's keep progressing from there. And then eventually remove these drills, right? I want you to squat. I want you to lunge. I want you to have fun with these different exercises, not have to do the regressed version forever. It's just I want to keep you safe, because that was the whole goal now, and everything that we started with, making sure I'm keeping you safe, but still getting an effective workout, because I want you to feel good when you leave me. I don't want you to feel like I just beat you up, right? Sometimes, yeah, you're sore and muscles hurt and things like that, but you're not in pain every time we work out because we didn't pay attention to some of these movements here. Okay, well, you guys made it. I really hope you enjoyed this. Like I said, I'm really passionate about this topic. It's something I've taken myself through and really seen an improvement in my personal movement and my exercise and my rate of injury dramatically decreasing. And I see the same thing with my clients. So hopefully this was pretty clear, and you have some practical things that you can leave with to start with your clients the next time you see them. So just a reminder, you are at the end. So you made it. Congratulations. You finished the webinar. So now you can head on over to the website at exerciseetc, click on the administrations tab at the top, go to the webinar on demand certificates. Remember to put it in exactly as you see it on the course. Answer the questions with the quiz, fill out the evaluation, and there you get your certificate. And just don't forget, make sure you are doing this in the same year of when you ordered it, to ensure that you're going to get credit for leading this webinar. All right, that's it. Again, my name is Mike Diebler. I hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we hope to see you back or at one of our live events